Well, we are here to talk about effective tactics for campaigns for safer streets. Though this definitely applies to really any campaign that you're running to get any kind of change, policy or street or otherwise. But yeah, we'll be talking about effective tactics. So let's get to it. Just first of all, this session is being recorded, so I'll make sure to send it out to all those folks who are not here now. I'm sure this is not your first Zoom call, but go ahead and put yourself on mute if you're not chatting. I will be stopping from time to answer questions. So if you have those questions, either write it down and hold off for the end of that section or to the end. Also feel free to stick it in the chat. So yeah, I'm sure that I don't have to introduce you all to Zoom, but down at the bottom of your screen is a little button for chat. You can throw that if you have any specific questions there, though it looks like we're a small enough group that I wouldn't mind an interruption. But also find your mute, and it looks like you all have found that there. How about we start off by just giving a quick introduction, go around the room. Who are you? Where are you from? And I suppose since there are fewer of us, what's one change that you would like to see in the streets around your neighborhood or on your way to work or something like that? So how about we start off with Chip? Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Chip Yakey. I'm in Ward 4 in Petworth at 7th and Taylor. And I guess one thing that I would like to see is the now split up phase 2 of the Crosstown project, which for those who aren't familiar, the Crosstown project is a cycle track project that's coming by the hospitals on Irving. And then there's a north-south portion of that on 5th and 7th Streets, which are Warder and Park in the southern part of that, and the Ward 1 part of that. That was all one project and was just recently split into two. The good news is the first part of it, I think, is being built pretty immediately, but the second part seems to be pretty delayed. So that's the
Today,
one.
they literally put in some of the concrete curbs for that first phase of the project.
Oh, nice.
It's
awesome.
Coming along nicely.
Good.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Dan?
Hi, my name is Dan Barron. I live in Riverdale Park, Maryland, which is in Prince George's County. I guess specific projects, the trolley trail that WABA has been advocating for a long time would be great to connect a couple of the neighborhoods here to the Anacostia Tributary Trail. And then I think just a lot of the trail network plans for the eastern part of the county would be great to see some of that additional connectivity in the future.
Awesome, thanks. And Jason?
Jason Clark, I live in Columbia Heights. Excited about the DDOT notice for the 14th Street project going forward. And I would love to see no cars on the roads, but that's just, very forward thinking. And I apologize for having to leave early to jump to an ANC meeting at 7.
Don't sweat it. We appreciate you being here. Great. Well, this will be, we're going to talk about tactics today. We're going to be alluding to a lot of other pieces that you might want to keep in mind for any kind of campaign or convincing anyone of anything. And I just wanted to note that I'm taking a lot of this from a really fantastic book called Organizing for Social Change, which is written by the Midwest Academy, which is a fantastic resource for activists. So if you're curious about anything we're going over here, I didn't make any of it up. I'm drawing from sitting on the shoulders of many wonderful people. Okay, cool. So, whoops, what are we talking about? We're talking about what is a tactic, what makes an effective tactic, and what tactics are effective specifically now. So to get into those, what is a tactic? Well, before we can dive into what a tactic is, it's important for us to actually think about specifying an issue. So just for the next 20, 30 minutes, I want you all to think about, try to put this all in the context of something specific you're trying to get accomplished. So to define that term, an issue is sort of a solution to a problem. So, for instance, traffic violence, speeding, unsafe bicycling and walking, these are problems. But building protected bike lanes or adding traffic calming to a street might be a solution. So that'd be our issue, building protected bike lanes to cut down on speeding and improve safety for biking. So before we talk about the things that we're doing to get there, important to actually define what that issue is. So a good issue should result in a real improvement in people's lives. It should be easy to understand. You should be able to have a quick conversation with someone about this issue and have them understand what you're talking about. It should also be widely felt. Very, very niche issues that don't affect many people are going to be harder to fight for. It should also be deeply felt. So people who are affected by this problem should feel deeply connected to it. It should, of course, be worthwhile, and it should be winnable. We don't need to be tilting at windmills. We want to actually accomplish something. So for example, on the screen here is an image of Lincoln Road Northeast, which is a street in DC. We are currently working with some amazing advocates in Ward 5 on a campaign to convert one lane of Lincoln Road into protected bike lanes. So that issue is to add protected bike lanes to this street to cut down on speeding and make it safer to bike there. So important to have an issue. I would encourage you all to think about what is your issue for the evening. I think you all identified some that would be perfect for this. Okay, so what's a tactic? Broadly speaking, a tactic is an action or an event that you do to advance your issue. It's an action, specifically, it's not a goal. A goal might be something broader, might be, for instance, a goal might be, I want my advisory neighborhood commission or my council member to sign on to my campaign, to give my support. But a tactic would be something that you do to win that council member's support or that advisory neighborhood commission's support. So an action is something that you or your group has complete ownership over. So an action might influence a result that somebody else makes, but the action is what you control. Some very simple examples that I'm sure you all have heard of, emailing a decision maker, sending a letter to the editor, designing and selling t-shirts on your issue, putting in a pop-up protected bike lane like this very cute one on screen here, rallies or protests. These are all tactics. Some of them take very little time to sort of organize and put together and think through. Some of them may take months. Importantly, any effective tactic should always make a specific demand of a decision maker. So if our issue were around safe streets and building a protected bike lane in a particular place, it's important that your tactic address a specific person who can help get you what you want, and actually make a specific ask of them. Very often, a lot of work is put into convening an event, and organizers forget to make the ask of the person. If not asked, nobody's going to give an answer that's difficult. So a tactic should always make a specific demand of a decision maker. To sort of get into that space, I wanted us all to go through a sort of quick exercise. There we are. So let's put on your imagination hat. Bring yourself back to when you were, say, an 8-year-old. Obviously, the most important need for an 8-year-old is that you need a bike. It's the one thing you want more than anything else. So let's think through, how would an 8-year-old go about getting a bike? For a little visual cue, let's say this is you. Obviously, bikes make you cool, so you need a bike. How do we get there? So very quickly, our issue is to be a really cool kid, I need a bike, right? But the real question comes down to how do we get there? So I want you to think through real quick, you know, what are some ways that you might, as an 8-year-old, advance this campaign to get a bike? Well, there's a lot of ways of doing it. But first off, you need a strategy. So maybe, you know, your neighbor Jimmy has a bike. Your strategy could be, I'm going to take that bike. That's one strategy. Maybe your PE teacher could give you a bike. Maybe you could win a contest. Maybe you could get, but most likely you're going to convince a family member to buy a bike for you, right? So let's just go ahead with that strategy. Maybe there are other winning ones. But now, looking at our family, you know, sure, we need to come up with an argument. We need to be convincing and articulate. So just a couple of maybe good arguments, you know, bikes are amazing and they're fun, or look at me, I'm so mature. Of course I deserve a bike. They're good for the environment. You know, these are all arguments that we've heard more. As you're getting older, maybe it saves mom and dad some trips. You know, or play sort of the look at the Joneses card. You know, everyone else has one. So let's say we find our good argument, but we get to our next step, which is, who is the person who can actually give us this bike? Who's our decision maker? And this is a critical step. I know I'm sort of glossing over a lot, but this is a really critical step for any tactic, but even more so for a campaign. You need to know who is the decision maker who can actually give you what you are working for. And to sort of identify who that decision maker is, it's important. We can do what's called power mapping. We can look at the field and see really who has the power to give it to us, and who do they listen to. So for our bike, you know, who in our family has the power to give this to us? And what other people in our family or who we know might be able to help out convince that person. So let's do some quick power mapping of say a fictitious family. First off, maybe, you know, it's a bike, so it's a thing that you need to buy. So who has approval of purchases? Who's in charge of that? In my case, let's say when I was a kid, an 8-year-old, that was mom. So mom is our primary target here. If mom decides that she's okay with me getting a bike, then I get a bike. Great. But maybe mom's, you know, hard to convince. We need some extra help. So who else can we turn to? Well, there's a whole bunch of people who mom might listen to, you know, maybe because they're related, or because they respect them, or because of sort of family politics. So that might mean, you know, dad or grandma or an uncle or a teacher. These are sort of secondary targets. It would be helpful to convince them to get on board with our issue. And they can help us convince the primary target. Our teacher is not necessarily going to buy us a bike, but they could be a helpful force in convincing mom to get us a bike. So that's an important level. But another level is sort of, you know, there are people all around, maybe groups of people who can help create that sort of positive pressure on mom, so that she starts thinking that this is a pretty good idea. Those people are sort of more public audiences. You have siblings, you have friend groups. They might not on their own have any authority to get you a bike. And mom might not really care what any one of them individually thinks. But when you put them together in a group and you organize them around in support of your issue, they can start to have some influence over that decision maker. Maybe if literally every one of your friends has a bike, mom might come around and say, okay, because if I don't say yes, you're making me look bad. and I do actually care about that. So, you know, to pick the right target, or sorry, to pick the right tactic, we need to understand sort of what the levels of decision making are and their relationships, so that we can actually target the right person with that tactic. I'm going to pause right there just for a moment, see if there are any questions. Okay, great. So we've done some power mapping of our family, and hopefully we have a better sense of like how tactics fit into that. So let's talk about what actually are effective tactics, right? And we'll get into like specifics of what these things actually are, but I think it's important to look behind and sort of think about what the most effective form of these things are. So at its core, an effective tactic is one that is focused on the decision maker. So if you want a bike, focus your efforts on mom, the person who can give it to you. It puts pressure behind a specific demand. So it's not just bikes are cool, but it's give me a bike. And also it should advance your goal. So if you're having interactions with mom, those interactions should be working towards getting you a bike. To use a different case for safe streets, for example, most streets in Washington, D.C. are under the authority of the District Department of Transportation, and that department has a director. So any tactics that we're using should be, at their core, focused on convincing the director of that department to do what we are asking. It should make a specific ask of, on this specific street, we would like you to put a protected bike lane here. And it should advance your goal in that getting what, you know, if that decision maker agrees with us, ideally, that should get us a protected bike lane. So those are sort of three main things. If you're not accomplishing those three things, maybe question whether or not this tactic, which probably takes some effort, is worth it. Secondary to that, sort of effective tactics will fit into one of these two categories, which is mostly an effective tactic will demonstrate your group's power to your decision maker, or it will educate and grow your base. So demonstrate your group's power. Power is a very deep concept that would take potentially an hour to run through. But basically, you know, your group's power is their ability to affect a decision that a person makes. So power comes from influence. It comes from, in some cases, like, you know, electoral power. Constituents have the power to not elect somebody in the future. Consumer power. Consumers have the power to affect a company's bottom line if they don't go and agree with them and take an action that they're asking for. There's a lot of different kinds of power, but a good tactic will demonstrate your group's power to that decision maker. And in educating and growing your base, education in itself is not the goal, but we should be educating our base about our issues and getting more people on with us. So effective tactics will do broadly those things. Let's, you know, and just to remind you all, an effective tactic will always be specific to that issue or that context or that decision maker. So very often, it's sort of tempting. You see a group doing an amazing thing, an amazing action. Say, well, protests are often very effective, but for instance, there was T-shirts are always a tactic that groups seem to go with. We have an issue. Let's make a T-shirt. Let's sell those T-shirts and get them out into the public. And if we get enough T-shirts out into the world, then maybe someone will take note of our issue. That may be effective for maybe some issues, but for the most part, they're not going to demonstrate your group's power to the decision maker unless literally every other person is wearing one of them. And they're probably not going to educate and grow your base. So it's always important to think through, like, what is the context of our campaign or issue before we pick a tactic. So just to run down some sort of typically effective tactics. A lot of these haven't actually changed much since, 30, 50 years ago. One of the most basic ones that's still really effective is a petition drive. Get signatures in support of an idea. For a street change, it's getting petition signatures from a bunch of neighbors who live near the street saying, we think the street is dangerous, we think it could be better, here's our specific idea for making it better. Petitions are directed at a decision maker. And the beautiful thing about a petition is it shows your power to that decision maker, because at some point you can plop down a stack of petition signatures on their desk and say, all of these people are asking you to get on our side on this issue. And it's also good for growing and educating your base, because it's an opportunity to lay out what your argument is. It's an opportunity to collect emails so that you can then very quickly mobilize people in the future. So petitions are not always the most exciting, but they're very effective. And this is something that WABA has, depending on your issue, we have a great platform for petitions. And if your issue lines up well with what we're working on, happy to help host that petition and do some of that legwork for you. Another always effective tactic is letter writing. Writing a letter directly to the decision maker and asking them for their support on your issue. Hi, council member so-and-so. I live at this address. I'm one of your constituents who can vote for you in the future. And I'm asking you to support protected bike lanes on this street. There's an element of volume there, and there's also an element of who is writing these letters. So if you only have one or two, maybe that decision maker is now aware of the issue, but they probably don't feel compelled to do anything about it if it's just one or two people. But if you have a couple hundred, then they'll start having to decide whether or not this is something they do something about. Also, relative to that decision maker, it matters who is writing those letters. Also matters who is signing these petitions. If it's a council member in, say, Hyattsville, they're probably going to respond most strongly to constituents, people who live in Hyattsville, who are writing letters to them or signing a petition. They probably don't care too much if it's a bunch of folks in Michigan, or a bunch of folks in Virginia, or even a bunch of folks in DC, because while it might be very loud and vocal, those folks aren't going to vote anyone out. They're not going to change anything in the next election. They don't hold much power over that decision maker. So it's important to think about who is the best person to write this letter, who is the best person to sign this petition. Another incredibly effective one is turnout events. Any kind of event where you can get a crowd of people who are all interested and supportive of an idea, put them together, and ideally invite the decision maker so that they can see that crowd of people and start connecting that crowd to this issue. Group rides for some Safe Streets projects can be really effective. Sometimes a slower paced project walk along the corridor that might be affected can be more effective. Here on the screen is actually a walk we did a couple of years ago focused on the Rhode Island Avenue Trolley Trail. This is a section that actually doesn't have a sidewalk. So we had like 50 people there. We actually had a lot of elected decision makers showing up. And again, connecting the importance of that issue for that elected leader. Yeah, and rallies and protests are very similar. Also, typically for safe streets projects and for any change to sort of the public realm, typically there are public meetings that happen, or hearings. Always an effective tactic is just packing the room, making sure that supporters for that project show up, that they're vocal, that they speak up and write comments. And another effective one is just visiting with public officials, organizing a sit-down meeting. You can think really carefully about who's actually in the room, who they represent, what communities they might represent, and what sort of power that community might have relative to your decision maker. So that can be really quite effective. Now, of course, all of this changes when we can't have large gatherings, when people don't want to meet face to face. But there's still quite a few effective tactics, and I should say, like that was a tiny list of tactics. But there are still plenty of tactics, many of the same ones that are just as effective today, especially now that everybody is so used to living and working online. Petition drives. You might not be able to stand out on a street corner or canvass your neighbors, not going to door to door and knocking, but you can, take advantage of community listservs and even Nextdoor, social media and all of those to get the word out about a petition and to grow your audience and eventually to deliver it to your elected official. Looking a little more online, an earlier step to something like a petition could be like a survey. So trying to gauge a community's interest in a particular issue, and using that as a catalyst to actually start the conversation. Letter writing is still just as effective. Letters to the editor still just as effective. And of course, we can still have meetings. They're just a little bit different. So we have, in the past couple of months, had quite a few really effective video meetings with some of our elected officials, where we get to stack the room and make sure that we're representing and speaking to the ideas and topics that we want to speak to, and also varying degrees of distanced protests. When this started in March, there were very quickly quite a few protests of folks, hopping in their cars and throwing some signs on the side of the car and driving around places honking the horn. I don't know that that's necessarily the most compelling way to get attention for safer streets. But there are plenty of ways of sort of gathering in meaningful ways. So I suppose a question for y'all, are you seeing any effective tactics that groups are using or that you have used, not just for safe streets, but for really anything? Feel free to chime in.
Well, I don't know about specific tactics here, but I did think that photo that you had from the Rhode Island Avenue trolley trail looked like it would be very effective to get people to recognize, because that's a stretch where I'm sure a lot more people who are elected officials have experience in cars rather than trying to walk up that section of street. And I guess I feel like locally I have not seen as much activity the last couple months. I know they're having a lot of emergency meetings and stuff like that, but I don't think from what I've seen, they've had kind of the robust engagement that some of the DC officials have done over Zoom and other stuff, but there has been a little bit more recently, so hopeful about that. And I guess the only other question I had was around the organizing something like that. How I imagine WABA has a relationship with a lot of officials in the area, so it's probably one thing, but like how consequential is like relationship building for making those requests or organizing those events?
Yeah, great question. I should say, first of all, just speaking to this event, I think one of the most powerful things about it was that it brought people, it brought our decision makers out of their comfort area. It challenged them, I'd say, just about the right amount, not too much and not too little, to think about how other people experience a place. But for the people who, for the sort of people who already supported the notion, this was very much in their comfort zone. So it's important to think about those two. You don't want to bring anyone too far out of your comfort zone. If you're, working with a group that's most used to all of their activities to date have been showing up in a room and meeting and talking, it's going to be a really big step to get them to show up to a protest. So thinking about sort of what the appropriate tactics are for a group. In terms of elected leaders and relationships, I think relationships are super critical, and those are something you build relationships over time, right? And that's built based on trust and sort of multiple interactions over a very long time. So I like to think of tactics as a way, tactics are a particular tactic happens in a moment in time. That's a way of growing that relationship, of perhaps deepening it, and also giving that decision maker or elected leader a better sense of who you are and what you're coming to the table with and who's coming with you. So if their impression is that you're just a single person who emails them once a week about an issue, they're going to start thinking about you very differently and your issue very differently if suddenly they come out to a meeting and there are 30 people there. So a tactic is a good chance to like redefine a relationship too.
Sure.
That's a great question. And I should say that since we're on the topic of Rhode Island Avenue, that is still moving along. The State Highway Administration is, they have a plan that actually looks pretty good and it's come a long way. The sort of next step, basically the design is done. It's just a matter of slotting this into their construction schedule. Obviously the budget challenges of this, it was supposed to be breaking ground this year, but budgets have been very challenging. Great. Chip, did you have any thoughts on tactics you've been seeing?
I mean, I'm not sure I can totally speak to the effectiveness, but we've over the last several years done a number of community rides and bike to work day rides with our Ward 4 council member, who doesn't seem like we moved him far enough, but I would say in conversations with him during and related to those, they were definitely eye-opening and definitely did do that, getting them to see it from a different perspective, getting him out of his comfort zone a bit. Whether it was effective, because he didn't end up voting for the things I would have wanted him to vote for, I'm not sure, but yeah, I think those can be good tactics too.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. I have one question, but did you want to
sorry, it all depends on what the sort of lay of the land is. If the decision maker who can give you what you're working towards is pretty far back on the spectrum of understanding your issues, maybe your first goal and your first couple of tactics are all based on narrowing that gap, and truly ride-alongs is, especially with like council members or delegates, it's a high bar. Not everyone's going to agree to do that, but it can be particularly effective in getting them to understand where y'all are coming from. And showing protected bike lanes or trails, as opposed to just riding in the street, that often gets the point across very well.
Well, or doing a ride where you ride on both really tends to show the difference pretty starkly. The other question I had was, you talked about packing the room for some of these meetings or community walks or what, any of those sort of things where you're trying to show your numbers in a sense. Are there particular strategies or for showing who's on my side and like it's easy to have a room full of 60 people and not actually know if that's 50-50 or if that's somewhere heavily tilted one direction or the other. So I'm curious if you have suggestions there.
Sure. A really good point. So I think it depends on the meeting, of course, and sort of what the context of that meeting is. If you're at, say, a community outreach event around a specific project, like there was a series of meetings on the Crosstown project.
Mm-hmm.
The decision maker, or the primary decision maker, may not be in the room,
Mm-hmm.
but some of the secondary decision makers might be, like the project staff, whose primary job there is to collect comments from people. So there, a pretty easy way to do it is just make sure that everybody who's there in support knows that their job is to write things, write down their comments in support, have
Mm-hmm.
conversations with as many staff members and as many community members about how they support this and why it's a good idea. You can have sort of multiple goals for one of those, but
Mm-hmm.
if you're drawing 30 people and each of them has a couple of conversations, you can actually really, give a staff member the impression of, gee, everybody, this seems to be exactly what people want. And that feedback will propagate up to, the ultimate decision maker. So yeah, definitely like writing things down and leaving evidence that people were there. If it's your meeting where you're recruiting people to it, even something like a simple show of hands, that's not going to work in every case, because a lot of times we're showing up to somebody else's meeting where there may be a lot of people there who disagree. So it depends.
Okay.
Not everything is a vote, but a show of
Right.
hands can effectively show what support there is.
Right.
And of course, the best way to pack a room and to know that there's a lot of support there is to, do a lot of work to recruit. Recruiting is a lot easier if you have an email list of people who support the thing. And petitions are a great way of building an email list, or building up a group that's already sort of supportive of these issues, and using that to turn out to many things. Cool. So this was meant to be sort of just a quick glimpse of like what, giving you all some framing for what effective tactics are. I think what's really exciting about working in this space is that, there is no such thing as a bad tactic. I would say there are only tactics that are not well matched to the issue. So again, making t-shirts could be an effective tactic for the right situation. But what's important is that you sort of think through, what are you trying to accomplish? Who are you trying to convince? And how can we show our power and grow our base? Yeah, and especially as things get, more and more online, especially these days in the days of pandemics, we're seeing things change. Folks using social media in a very different way. I mean, even something like on a national scale, painting a street with a message of Black Lives Matter, that is a tactic. And I think it was, well, there's a huge discussion of whether or not it was effective for that issue. But for the person who did it, I think it was very effective in achieving one of the goals on that national scale. So happy to talk more about this, but definitely wanted to wrap up and let you all go if you'd like to. Just wanted to give a note that we have some more sort of trainings coming up. Last week, we ended up postponing a training for sort of making a case for a project. We will be rescheduling that. And that one's all about sort of what are some of the ways and some of the mediums that we can use to make the case. Everything from having useful talking points to playing with some fun tools to show graphically what a Safe Streets project could do to change a street. So that should be fun. We'll be announcing that soon. Next week, we'll be talking specifically, this will be specifically to DC, but might be applicable to other communities, sort of best practices for working with advisory neighborhood commissioners who are very hyper-local decision makers, especially around streets. Later, who decides is all about sort of the process and project pipeline of how transportation projects move along and where sort of the levers are and decision points along the way. And finally, something that will be similar to this discussion, sort of planning to win. How can we plan overall a strategic campaign to get support around an issue and win? So you can find all about those at waba.org/fun, where we have actually all of our events, not just trainings. Yeah, if you all have any other questions, I'm happy to stick around for a while. But otherwise, thanks so much for joining.